May I have your attention? We're about ready to get started. My name is Marcel Wilson. I'm the site manager here at the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor. This year we're celebrating our 30th anniversary, and we invite you to come back and
Hold on.
This year we're celebrating our 30th anniversary.
Here we go. Sorry about that.
There was an echo. We invite you back to our lecture series. It's 4 lectures. There'll be one in April. Bill Lawson from the Mahoning Valley Historical Society will be here. Dr. Leary from YSU will be here in June. And then we have several members from OCA here in September. And then we have Dr. Donald de Blasio, a retired professor from YSU here in November. So if you want to find out more information about it, you can visit our website. Tonight we welcome Dr. Pat Farabaugh. He's a professor of communications at St. Francis University in Loretto, Pennsylvania. He also taught at Indiana University of Pennsylvania and Penn State University. He earned his PhD in political and cultural communications from Penn State. His previous books include Carl McIntyre, Crusade Against the Fairness Doctrine, and An Unbreakable Bond, The Brotherhood of Maurice Stokes, and Jack Twyman. He's also a contributing author to American Sports, A History of Icons, Idols, and Ideas. And today he's going to speak on the Johnstown Club.
Thank you, Marcel. Thank you for coming out on a beautiful day. One of the nicest we've had in 2022, so I appreciate you being inside on such a lovely evening. As Marcel said, I am from St. Francis. I teach there, and it is a rural school, if you're not familiar, in a tiny town of Loretto, Pennsylvania, which is about 40 to 45 minutes north of Johnstown. I grew up in that area. I grew up on a potato farm in the town of Carrolltown, Pennsylvania, which is not far. It's in Cambria County, if you are familiar with the region. I teach in communications, but I was telling Tom I have a love of history. I'm thankful to work in a profession that allows me to pursue different topics, and I have definitely pursued different topics. My first book was on telecom policy, a former policy called the Fairness Doctrine. My second book was on the relationship between 2 professional basketball players, one from Ohio, Jack Twyman, and one of our native sons at St. Francis, Maurice Stokes. And this is a book that I tackled. I've been working on it for the better part of 6 or 7 years, summers mostly, and it came out in October, and I've been appreciative of the opportunities to speak on it. I spoke on it at a number of different areas within the Johnstown area. I was at the National Museum of Industrial History in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and that is the headquarters for Bethlehem Steel, which was the big operator in Johnstown for many years. And I just want to share with you a little bit about my book tonight. I have copies of the book. If anyone would like a copy, I have them for purchase after the program. They are $20 each. If you know of someone who might be interested in the book but is not here, I also have flyers. Feel free to take these with you when you exit tonight and share them with people that you might know. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the floods that have hit the city of Johnstown. It has actually, the History Channel about 3 weeks ago had a program on the 1889 Johnstown flood, and that was one that the city is synonymous with, but we've been also hit by several other floods. And I talk about the title suggests what I talk about in the book. What I'm talking about tonight are the 3 major floods: 1889, 1936, and 1977, and then the ebbs and flows of the steel industry in the city as well. So I'll talk for a bit, and then a lot of the presentations that I've had, people have shared stories about their family members who worked in the steel industry or the coal industry, and we can do a Q&A, but I'd also love to hear some of the stories that maybe some of you have from family who worked in the industry. Why did I tackle this book? A couple of reasons. The gentleman on the left is my mom's dad. He's passed on, but his name was John Earl Bolin, and he was a laborer in Cambria County coal mine. He's holding my Aunt Jean. That's my mom's older sister. He was a laborer in Cambria County coal mines from 1932 to 1970. And before I was born, but I heard the story, he fractured his back in the fall of '62 in a mine in Revlon when something fell from the mine ceiling. And I heard stories about how he overcame that injury. He was taken to Conemaugh Valley Memorial Hospital, which interestingly was built after the 1889 flood. Doctors drilled holes in each side of his head. He was placed in cervical traction for 6 weeks. One of his feet was temporarily paralyzed, and he didn't have the technology that we have today. He created basically his own electrical stem. He had 2x4, so I've been told, I never saw it. It had cake pans attached to each side, and he had bare wires, and he would put these wet towels, evidently, in the cake pans. He plugged the wire in to the wall, and he would touch the bare wire onto the wet towels to try to create stem for muscle regrowth, and to punch a boxing bag. And eventually, he did regain use of his fingers. His nerve endings had been damaged, as well as his foot, and he was back in Bethlehem within 6 months. So he was a catalyst for me to tackle this, just because I heard stories from him when I was little. And then David McCullough's book on the 1889 flood, the famed historian, it was actually his first book. It came out in 1960. He's still alive. McCullough is, but it was his first book in 1968, published by Simon and Schuster. And I mean, my work obviously is, tackles the 1889 flood, but not in nearly the depth that he did. But I felt like Johnstown's story was not told in its entirety. And so I decided to share the stories of that flood in a condensed fashion, as well as the other floods that have hit Johnstown. So that was the catalyst for me to tackle this. We'll start off with a little quiz. I am a teacher. I think I mentioned this already. Does anyone know the Great Flood, the one McCullough talks about, when it was 1889 was the year of the Great Flood that hit the city. This company was founded in Johnstown. This is a bit of a trick question. In 1852. What's that?
Cambria.
Cambria Ironworks. Cambria Ironworks operated in Johnstown from 1852 to 1898, and then changed their name to Cambria Steel from 1898 to 1916. The Midvale Steel and Ordnance Company out of Philadelphia for a short while from 1916 to 1922, and then Bethlehem Steel took over operations in 1922 and continued until they declared bankruptcy in 2003. All right, last question. Geography question. Which of the following rivers does not flow through the Johnstown region? Anybody know? Anybody in here been to Johnstown? Okay.
I think it's A.
It's A. That's right. Juniata is down Juniata County, Blair County. So the rivers, all right, you guys did well. All right, everybody gets an A on the quiz. So a little bit about the geography of Johnstown. It's about 60 miles east of Pittsburgh. It is in the Allegheny Mountains. It is sort of wrapped around by the Stony Creek and the Little Conemaugh Rivers. The Stony Creek is about 45 miles long and drains an area south of Johnstown called the Stony Creek Valley. The Little Conemaugh River begins north of Johnstown, not far from our campus at all. We're in Loretto, but the two tiny towns of Crescent and Evansburg are nearby. That's where the Little Conemaugh begins, and they meet in the city to form the Conemaugh River. The Conemaugh, where bodies of water connect Conemaugh River is one of the primary tributaries of the Allegheny, and then the water from the Allegheny eventually finds its way into the Gulf. That's a statue of who is deemed the city's founder. It is in the square in the downtown portion of the city. His name is Joseph Shantz, and he and his family staked a claim of 30 acres near the Stony Creek River in 1769. He was changed his name to Joseph Johns, and if you can see, that is the name on the statue, but they founded the community that was renamed Johnstown in 1834 as Shawnstadt. And Johnstown became, there's a lot of railroad history in Johnstown, in Crescent, in the Altoona area, the part of the state where St. Francis is located and where I grew up in. And Johnstown was a very important location for many years on the mainline canal system. The rail history ties into the canals. In the first half of the 19th century, I mentioned the Allegheny Mountains, canal transport was not possible between the community of Hollidaysburg, which is located in Blair County, not far from Altoona, and Johnstown because of the rugged terrain. And so these two, this area, the canal came up to Hollidaysburg, and then it would resume in Johnstown. Those two portions of the canal system were connected by rails. And so goods and supplies that were being carried on the canals would have to be loaded onto rail cars, transported by the Allegheny Portage Railroad. Actually, the first railroad tunnel in the United States is in that stretch, the Staple Bend Railroad Tunnel. And so it was an important spot. And this contributed to Johnstown becoming a leading producer of iron because it was a hub on the mainline canal system. The Cambria Iron Works, which David McCullough writes extensively about, became a leading producer of steel, employing more than 7,000 men. Where there are mills, there are mines, and there's a lot of bituminous coal in the mountains above the city, and so the coal was taken from the mines to power the mills. And this isn't me talking. That quote that I have at the bottom is certainly a historian with more clout than I have, but he describes Johnstown as, it is fair to say that the age of steel began in that city in western Pennsylvania. Once the rails, so obviously canal transport, right, rail transport took over for canal transport. And once the rails had been laid all the way from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, the Pennsylvania Railroad abandoned the mainline canal. And they sold a dam used in the system that sat 14 miles upstream from Johnstown to a group of business leaders from the Pittsburgh area, and that was the Southport Dam. It was, at the time, the largest earthwork dam in the world. 15 businessmen led by, all connected in some way, shape, or form through Andrew Carnegie. The front man formed the group was Benjamin Rupp. They bought this dam, and they were all Pittsburgh business leaders, and they wanted a place to get away from their work environment. And so they bought this dam, and they wanted to make it a little getaway. The Southport Fishing and Hunting Club. They started working on it in 1879. It's not your hunting camp. It was pretty luxurious. 47-room clubhouse, steam yachts, and again, they were all connected in some way through Carnegie Steel. Interestingly, Andrew Carnegie, he never set foot. Even though they were all connected, he never actually was on the club's grounds. Obviously, what happens, people don't stick around. The club doesn't have a long staying period. He had a summer home in Crescent, Carnegie did, named Braemar. And he fell in love. His mother actually died of Braemar. He never went back, but he fell in love with that part of the Alleghenies. And so that was the catalyst for him to tackle this project. They started building. Daniel Morrell was the head of the Cambria Iron Works when the construction of the Southport Fishing and Hunting Club commenced, and he had serious concerns, right? This is 14 miles from Johnstown. and he had concerns about what they were doing to the dam. They were making some modifications to the dam. They widened it and put an access road across it for carriage travel, right? This is the late 19th century. They removed runoff pipes that were embedded in the dam's base. They brought a tanker car, black bass, because they wanted to fish. They put screens in to contain those fish within the dam. Morrell, who pretty much ran Johnstown, we were just talking about how the mining and the mills, they had the stores, they had the housing. Daniel Morrell had real concerns about what they were doing. So he sent up an engineer that worked for him named John Fulton. Fulton looked at the dam, went back to Morrell, to his boss, and said, I think that what they are doing might compromise the integrity of the dam. He wrote a letter to Ruff. Ruff said there's nothing to worry about. Daniel Morrell would die before he would see what would befall his adopted city. He was not a native Johnstowner, but he would pass before 1889. On May 28th of that year, a storm formed over the middle of the country and moved east. May 30th, we know it as Memorial Day now, but it was known as Decoration Day before it became Memorial Day. There was a parade downtown on May 30th. On the morning of May 31st, Elias Unger, who was a caretaker of the Southport Fishing and Hunting Club, he woke up to a dam that looked like it might give way. He quickly assembled a team of workers, and they tried a couple of different strategies, none of them successfully. They tried to unclog a spillway. They tried to mound dirt to build up, again, it was an earthen dam, build up the wall. At some point, late morning or early afternoon, they realized that their efforts were not going to be successful. Unger ordered the team to go to higher ground. He tried to send a message and made it as far as a very tiny town of Mineral Point, not all the way to Johnstown, that this dam might give way. And mid-afternoon, it did. On May 31st, the last day of May in 1889, the dam collapsed and 20 million tons of water, an estimated 20 million tons were released. More than 2,200 people were killed. Among those 2,200, 2,299 entire families were killed, not adjusted for what the cost would be today, but by 1889 number, 17 million in damages, and so many homes destroyed. That's the path of the 1889 flood. And here are a few pictures. The photos, most of the photos that I have in this presentation are from JAHA, which is the Johnstown Area Heritage Association. And, I was talking with Tom, the CEO of JAHA, as we call it. His name is Richard Kirkard. He wrote the forward from our book. He is the expert on all things Johnstown floods, and I'm very thankful to him. He helped proofread my book. The book relies on an oral history project that was conducted through JAHA. I also tapped into an oral history project that was conducted in the 1970s through Lehigh University, which is where Bethlehem is headquartered, in addition to interviews that I conducted. So these are some pictures from Johnstown. This deluge that gave way mid-afternoon of the 31st, it picked up debris as it barreled to Johnstown. The one thing that as I worked in this project, I was just astounded by the power of Mother Nature. It picked up locomotives, estimated 33 locomotives, more than 200,000 pounds of cables and wires, trees. I mean, there's lots of stories of people who rode debris like ships during the flood. The Woodville section of the city was hit especially hard. 1,100 people were killed in that part of Johnstown. The picture in the upper right is a sandstone railroad bridge, known as the Stone Bridge, in Johnstown. The water jammed there. It also jammed at the Conemaugh Viaduct, and that allowed the water to gain even more ferocity. Ironically, a lot of people lost their lives in a fire in the flood. There was not just one, but multiple oil tankers spilled onto the water. People lost their lives in a fire during a flood, ironically. Again, to imagine being a survivor, many of the people who lived lost all their earthly possessions. I also, Johnstown is an incredibly resilient place, and I talk about that in the book as well. That's a picture of Claire Barton, who founded the Red Cross in 1881, right? So only 8 years before the flood, and led the agency for almost a quarter century, for 23 years. She arrived in Johnstown just days after the flood, stayed until October, had a staff of around 50 volunteers. They actually got there in early June, on June 5th. Every state, we didn't have 50 states at the time, but every state in the U.S. at the time, as well as international aid, came to Johnstown. A man named Daniel Hastings, who would later serve as the state's governor. He was from Bellefonte, which is over by State College, Pennsylvania, in that part of Pennsylvania. He was tasked with coordinating the cleanup efforts. Interestingly, after the 3 floods, I'm going to talk to you about government officials enacted some semblance of martial law, and Daniel Hastings did that to try to keep the situation under control. What happened to the Southport Fishing and Hunting Club? Well, there were all lawsuits that were filed. None of them were successful. Courts, state, federal level ruled that it was an act of God, unforeseeable, even though they had made the modifications to the dam. The courts might not have found anyone culpable, but the court of public opinion certainly did. The members of the Southport Fishing and Hunting Club were vilified in the press and the international press. News outlets, newspapers from Europe came to Western Pennsylvania. This is a quote from the editor of the Johnstown Tribune, the newspaper at the time. We think we know what struck us, and it was not the work of providence. Our misery is the work of man. There was a woman who wrote a book titled Johnstown and its Flood that came out in 1936, interestingly, the year of the next major flood I'm going to talk to you about. And this just gives you a sense for the prevailing sentiment at the time. This is Gertrude Quinn Slattery from her book. A colony of railroad and steel company officials protected the birds and other forest folk and stocked the dam with a variety of game fish. The fish disported themselves in these cool waters, and they grew and multiplied. It became important, so important, in fact, that when the days and days of heavy rain drenched the hills, turned the rivulets into raging torrents, and sent them hurtling down to pour their fullness into the reservoir, the gentle keeper felt he could not open the floodgates, lest the valuable fish escape. So, blame was placed squarely by residents of the community at the feet of the members of the Southport Fishing and Hunting Club. Not surprisingly, they didn't stick around the area. The club broke up entirely 15 years after the Great Flood. Johnstown bounced back very quickly after the flood. And again, I think it speaks to the resilience. As I mentioned, the name changed. It became Cambria Steel in 1889. They built a new mill in Franklin. They built a new wire plant in Morelville. By the turn of the century, 16,500 roughly people were employed at Cambria Steel. You can see the mines were also booming in the region. In addition to steel production, in 1916, as I mentioned in our quiz to open, the Midvale Steel and Ordnance Company in Philadelphia purchased Cambria Steel, and then 6 years later, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, headquartered in the Lehigh Valley in eastern Pennsylvania, bought the holdings in Johnstown. Eugene Grace was the president of Bethlehem Steel at the time, and he indicated that his predecessor, Charles Schwab, would play an active role in what was going on at Johnstown. So a little bit about Schwab. Again, my book is a mix of flood history, but also the ebbs and flows of the steel industry. And as it relates to speaking here, at your museum, the Museum of Industry and Labor, I talk a bit about obviously the strike of 1919, the strike of 1959, and some of the ebbs and flows of the labor movement, in addition to some of the flood history in the city. So Charles Schwab is a big name in Bethlehem Steel. He was born in Williamsburg, which is in Blair County. It is neighbors Cambria County, where Johnstown is located. He was the son of John, and my last name is Farabaugh, as Marcel said. His mother was a Farabaugh, Pauline. I don't know if we're related. I don't get any special privileges in the Schwab Gardens in Loretto. But he was the oldest of the couple's 8 children. And he was born in Williamsburg in 1862, and where St. Francis is located, the school I teach at, his family moved there in 1862. I was talking to some folks before, and he's laid the rest. Charles Schwab is in the tiny, tiny town. Some places are a 1 stoplight town. Loretto is a 0 stoplight town. All right, we got a statue at our lone intersection in our community. He's laid to rest at St. Michael's Basilica in our community, where St. Francis is located. He moved to Pittsburgh in 1879, and he really made an impression on Andrew Carnegie. He landed a job at the Edgar Thompson Steelworks, which was owned by Carnegie. When the head of that plant was killed in an explosion, Carnegie appointed Schwab to the role of superintendent of the plant at the age of 27, and he became the president of Bethlehem Steel in 1904. And he was someone who was not afraid to take risks. He was a riverboat gambler. He would boom and bust. Charles Schwab would die in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York, $338,000 in debt, after owning one of the largest mansions in Manhattan. So that was the way this guy lived. And he led Bethlehem in a similar fashion. You can see his legacy in some of the skylines of the cities of the Northeast. He was a proponent of structural beams instead of riveted girders. I'm not going to go into any depth on that, but he had some vision when it came to the steel industry. And there's a quote from a labor historian, John Strohmeyer, as to how important he was. And his risk-taking translated into large profits for Bethlehem. They had a plant in Sparrows Point, Maryland, Lackawanna plant in the Buffalo area. They had the headquarters in Eastern PA, and Johnstown proved very lucrative to them as well. So Charles Schwab was someone that really put Bethlehem on the map in terms of the steel industry. There's his Riverside Mansion in Manhattan on the left. And on the right is his immigrant estate in Loretto, which is just across the street from our campus, from St. Francis University. Carnegie, he owned a mansion on 5th Avenue in New York City. He once said to somebody, "Have you seen that place of Charlie's? It makes mine look like a shack." So he lived large. It was the largest private residence in New York City, that one on the left, 90 bedrooms. It had a power plant in it. And like I said, he died at 77, the age of 77 in 1939, deep in debt. But he was someone that really made Bethlehem Steel go in the early part of the 20th century. The strike of 1919 in Johnstown and in other places, in Youngstown, was very impactful. September of that year, 300,000 or so mill and mine workers around the country refused to report to work. It was really sort of the opening shots of the struggle between management and labor that would take place, over the next couple, well, at least the next generation and a half. It was Mid-Belt Steel at the time in Johnstown. About 15,000 employees of the Midvale Steel and Ordnance Company walked off the job. The press, not unlike Youngstown, not unlike Steubenville, not unlike other cities that we call Rust Belt communities, they told the laborers, you want more money, save it. They were not on the side, nor were the clergy members in the Johnstown area. We're not on the side of labor. There was actually a clergy member who did express his support of what the Midvale men were striking for, and the body that oversaw that church relieved him of his pastoral responsibilities. And so they faced a lot of backlash, but it was really an important point to let the Charles Schwab and the other steel leaders, the Carnegies, know that we are going to fight for better conditions, more pay. And the strike of 1919, that's not from Johnstown, that photo, that's actually a strike during the a photo from a rally during the 1919 strike in Pittsburgh. But Johnstown was definitely impacted by the strike of 1919. 10 years later, the stock market crash impacted, it was felt across the steel industry. I read about Bethlehem Steel, and Bethlehem Steel was absolutely impacted by the market crash of 1929. You can see that year, Bethlehem produced 55 million tons of steel. 2 years later, 15 million tons less. By the beginnings of the Depression, incredibly, 90% of the nation's 500,000 or so steel workers were working part-time or out of work altogether. Schwab and Grace, they cut Bethlehem workers' wages by 10% in 1931. They cut them by 15% in 1932. Schwab's annual salary in 1932 was $250,000, and he didn't make any adjustments to his salary while he was cutting the laborer salary. Grace, not counting bonuses, in 1932 was $180,000. And foreign steel was beginning to find its way into the U.S. And Schwab and Grace, as well as other steel leaders, they begged the federal government to have higher barriers of entry to foreign steel, which was making it very, very difficult for domestic steel producers to compete. So 1919, 1929, impactful years for Bethlehem Steel. 1936, the second major flood hits Johnstown. Now, again, Johnstown, if you go there, it sits at the bottom of a valley. Gravity prevails, water goes downhill. And there were other flooding events in Johnstown. I talk about the three major ones, but there was serious flooding just 2 years after the 1889 flood in 1891. Another serious flooding event in 1894. People lost their lives in those events. The next major flood was in March of 1936. Heavy rains. There had been a very, very heavy snowfall the winter of 35 into 36. And the snow accumulated and didn't melt, it stayed frigid. And so when March came, and we're seeing this right now, right? We're supposed to get snow this weekend. So we go from 60 degrees to 20 degrees. And so that snow melted very rapidly. Heavy rains also arrived, the snow melted fast. And in Cambria City, which is a section of Johnstown, some of the heights of the waters in the flood of the St. Patrick's Day flood of 1936 reached higher marks than they had in the 1889 flood. Not nearly any loss of life is tragic. Obviously not the numbers that happened in 1889. 24 people were killed in the 36 flood. Property damage around 41 million. Statue that, not the statue I showed you, but a statue of Joseph John at the time, in sort of an ominous story from this flood, was decapitated, and the head of the statue was seen riding on the waves of the flood. The inclined plane, Johnstown has the steepest, well, they advertise it as the steepest, and I have no reason to doubt that it isn't, the steepest vehicular inclined plane in the world. And the incline which had been previously owned by Bethlehem. They didn't use it anymore. It had been sold for $1 to the city, and it carried more than 2,000 residents to safety in Westlawn, which is a suburb that sits above Johnstown during the 1936 flood. The mayor of Johnstown, he was a Republican in a in a working class city. His name was Daniel Shields. He had held the post just for 2 months, but like General Hastings had done in the cleanup efforts after 1889, Mayor Shields also instituted some semblance of martial law. He ordered all businesses that sold alcohol closed for an indefinite period of time. He tried to keep out people who, onlookers that wanted to see what was going on. So again, a semblance of martial law. Here's a few images from Johnstown. The streets probably don't mean much to you, but that top photo is Franklin Street, the one that's sort of sepia tone. Those are actually pianos. The Capitol building sold grand pianos, baby grand pianos, and first they were in the water, and then when the water recessed, they laid in the muck. And that's another thing. After a flood, we think about waters, but the cleanup, the mud, the filth, the grime, it's everywhere. A few companies tried to poach businesses from the region, saying, come to our city. We've never flooded, right? We won't flood. Most Johnstown companies said we're not going to bail on these people. We're going to stay. But it was a bit of a poaching season after the 36 flood. The lower right is the Franklin Street Bridge, and it was sitting in the middle of the Conemaugh River. FDR is president at the time. He visits, so the flood's in March of 36. President Roosevelt visits in August of that year, and he timed it. He arrived right when they were changing shifts, so he could get a big crowd. And he promised that picture. You can see him sitting. That's actually Charles Schwab's Packard limousine. He loaned it. The gentleman that's pointing, that is Governor George Earl, Pennsylvania Governor George Earl, then FDR, and then Mayor Shields. Johnstown's Mayor Daniel Shields is to FDR's left in the car. He came to Johnstown and he freed up federal dollars in a bill that was called the Local Flood Protection Program. And it was, the money was secured over the next couple of years. Work on a channel system began in August of 1938, was completed 5 years later. And after it was completed, Roosevelt sent a letter to Walter Krebs, a man named Walter Krebs. He was the chairman of a committee called the Flood-Free Johnstown Committee. And this is a quote from the president in this letter to Krebs. Johnstown from now onwards will be free from the menace of floods. Happily for the future of Johnstown, its citizens can now devote all their energies to their ordinary pursuits without worry over the impending hazard of uncontrolled water. So this channelization project, which was designed to expand some of the the amount of water that the riverbeds could contain, there were people from the area who said it wasn't enough. A state official named James Bogardus, he said, we need some reservoir to build. In addition to what this channel project will do, we also need some reservoirs to be built in the tributaries of Stony Creek. And that part of the project was not pursued. And that would prove consequential in the third flood I'm going to talk to you about. 1936, Johnstown certainly was not the only city to have serious flooding. Pittsburgh suffered its worst flooding in its history that year. March of 1936, 69 people were killed in the city of Pittsburgh. There was flooding across the Mid-Atlantic and the New England regions at that time. Again, there were people who stepped up, both locally, regionally, and nationally. The PA National Guard, 1,800 National Guardsmen were sent to Johnstown by the Governor George Earl. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was alive and well. During the 1937, 1,000 WPA workers were sent to the city, 350 trucks, WPA trucks. And again, what did they do? They cleaned up mud, animal remains, right? The risk of disease, you have to get dead animals out of, out of there as soon as possible. Spoiled food, you had to get all that out of the city. So those are some of the things that the members of the WPA were doing. Again, the generosity of our community. We have good people. There's good people here, and in these coal and these Rust Belt communities, coal belt cities, working class people. Coal companies would still march, right? I'm still heating my home in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and they were still heating homes in March of 1936. Coal companies provided coal for residents to heat their homes for free. They'd dump them, and then they would get advertising out on the locations. As mentioned, I grew up on a potato farm. We don't pick potatoes quite like this anymore, but it's a little more technologically driven. But the Pennsylvania, or the farmers in the region, donated part of their harvest from the previous year to Johnstown residents who had lost their homes and lost some of their loved ones. Red Cross stepped up again. Picture on this slide is a guy named Robert Bondi. He was a director of disaster relief for the Red Cross. And there were different refugee centers, first aid stations, and I mentioned the coal distribution sites. So the Red Cross is critical, again, to Johnstown getting back on its feet, as they had been after the 1889 flood. There's a quote from Bondi there, just talking about Johnstown's resiliency. Okay, let me talk a little bit before I get to the 77 flood about what was going on in Bethlehem Steel specifically, and the steel industry more generally. Most of you know this, during World War II, it was a boom period for the steel industry. Bethlehem was no exception. In 1945, shortly after the war, Eugene Gray stepped down as president at Bethlehem Steel. A man by the name of Art Homer took over. At that time, Bethlehem in Johnstown, its holdings in Johnstown, operations in that city, there were about 18,000 who were employed. There was a post-war decline in the production of steel, and there were several factors at play here, right? You were seeing progress being secured in the labor movement. You were seeing working conditions improve. You were seeing more income for the laborers. You were also seeing what I mentioned earlier, international competition. I presented, as I mentioned, at the National Museum of Industrial History in Bethlehem, and there was a gentleman there who attended that event, and he said, I remember being in courtrooms and just hearing these steel officials, lamenting the way that foreign steel was able to come in, really unfettered, and then the challenges that presented. So you had international competition. You also had in Bethlehem, specifically, and that's what I write about, a lack of innovation. I talked about Charles Schwab being a visionary, being an innovator. Under Eugene Grace, Bethlehem had very much become stagnant. Eugene Grace was not the forward thinker, was not the innovator. And again, had you had Charles Schwab in the 40s and 50s, the writing was on the wall for steel, but Eugene Grace felt that Bethlehem could respond, only if conditions warranted. So very few improvements, structural improvements were made during Grace's time as president. You also had the emergence of substitute products, aluminums, plastics, to a certain extent, ceramics, that you didn't need as much steel because you had other products that were viable substitutes. You saw the emergence of stricter environmental standards. The Department of Environmental Resources is now the Department of Environmental Protection. I'm one of 6. I have a brother and a sister who work as engineers with the DEP. But the DER at the time was telling steel companies, not unlike automobile producers today, that you have to clean up the emissions that your companies are in the way they produce steel. The way they produce steel was changing. Open hearth furnaces were giving way to a process called the basic oxygen furnace. And all of this was happening. You saw the unionization of the workforce. All of these things were challenges for the steel industry, and Bethlehem specifically, primarily under Eugene Grace's watch, they did not handle these wave of changes well. When you talk about the steel industry and the labor movement, you talk about the two right big bookends, the strike of 1919 and the strike of 1959. July of 59, 500,000 steel workers went on strike across the nation. Lasted 116 days. That's the cover of Bethlehem's monthly publication, Bethlehem Review, on that slide. Incredibly, you see my third bullet item there, shut down the 59 strike, did 87% of the nation's steel-making capacity. The steel companies consolidated. They were competitors, but Bethlehem, U.S. Steel, other big steel companies, Republic Steel operated here in the Youngstown area. And actually, Youngstown, what we're talking about Youngstown, its iron and steel production here dates back to the middle of the 1800s. So I'm talking about Johnstown. Youngstown is, and I don't have to tell you guys this, but you probably know this, that it was a big time steel producer. Produced iron in the 2 decades after the Civil War, began producing steel during the 1890s as the Ohio Steel Company. And of course, Republic Steel and U.S. Steel operated in the city for many years. And the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, which was locally owned, produced steel for many years before merging with the Lakes Corporation in 1969, which was a company out of New Orleans. But they consolidated. The steel leaders said, hey, right, we have the labor unions are organizing nationally and working in concert with one another. Why don't we do the same thing? And so the labor leaders tried. And what they wanted to get rid of was something called Clause 2B. This was adopted in a collective bargaining agreement 3 years before the 59 strike. And what Clause 2B was, it really handcuffed management. It limited their ability to change the number of workers assigned to a task, or introduce new work rules, or machinery that would result in reduced hours for members of the workforce. So it was very, very restrictive in terms of the steel companies trying to streamline what they wanted to do. And that was the line in the sand of the 59 strike. Feather bedding was a term that was synonymous with Clause 2B, and it was basically where you'd be assigned meaningless tasks and time-consuming ones so that you had something to do when you were on the clock, because companies weren't producing as much steel. The unions had negotiated contracts where these people had jobs, and this feather bedding would say, give them something to do. So these last two items were something that management wanted to fight, and in the end, labor gained even more ground in the 59 strike. All right, the last flood I want to talk to you guys about. Well, before we get to 77, the Vietnam War did provide a boom for Bethlehem as well as some other steel producing companies. But I also argue that it sort of masked what was coming. And that was a steep drop off of the need for the level of steel production that we once had. So Johnstown was going through challenges. The Bethlehem Steel, its holdings in Johnstown were struggling when another flood hit the city. Anyone in here ever see the movie Slapshot? It's a hockey movie. It was running. It was actually shot in Johnstown. It's funny. It's a little vulgar. Paul Newman's in it, but it's a funny movie. It was running in Johnstown in July of '77. For those of us old enough to remember, it was the night of the 1977 Major League Baseball All-Star Game in Johnstown, July 19th. When people I interviewed, a lot of people remember watching the All-Star Game. Pirates had a player named Dave Parker playing in the game, back when the Pirates had All-Stars. They don't have very many of those anymore. Storm formed over the middle of the country, just as it had in 1889, moved eastward, as storms typically do, and it gained power as it moved across the Mid-Atlantic into Johnstown, and just planted itself itself over Cambria County, Johnstown, southern part of Cambria County. NWS called it a blob of precipitation and would, after the fact, describe it as a once in every 10,000 year occurrence. And FDR promised that the city was going to be flood free. Well, it wasn't. Again, heavy snowfall, as had happened in 36. Trying to be preemptive, the Army Corps of Engineers tried to keep water flowing. So when the snow melt did happen, you can move it. So they were fearful of what might happen, and with good reason. In July, began raining heavily around 6:30, July 19th. The mayor at the time was a guy named Herb Fuel. He toured the city, 2 a.m., but there were a lot of communication channels that were out. Television was out, radio was out in many areas, electricity was out. The mayor declared a disaster area, the city a disaster area, but a lot of people, you know, they didn't have the electricity to get that message. So many people remember the lightning. And I asked people, they were like, oh my gosh, the lightning. It was like daylight for 30, 40 seconds on end. The brightness of the lightning in the 77 flood. Not unlike 1889, there were two major fires that ignited during the 77 flood. Again, it might not mean much to you who aren't familiar with the area. Cornerstown is a section of Johnstown. 12 bodies were found that had been, people had lost their lives because of fire in the days after the 77 flood. The hardest hit section, it had been Woodville in 1889. 77 has eerie similarities to 1889. Tanneryville is a community, a working class, very much a working class community. That picture there is of the Laurel Run homes in that community. And just as the Southport Dam had broken and caused a catastrophic loss of life in 1889, there was a dam that sat above this section of Tanneryville called the Laurel Run Dam. And it had been built actually before the 1889 flood, 20 years before. You can see there on the slide. It gave way. Assessors of the dam had said this dam is inadequate if you get a large storm event. 77 brought that. And then again in 1959, a state assessment of the dam said the spillway was not sufficient under PA guidelines. And then 7 years before the flood, FEMA classified it as high hazard. What gave way? The Laurel Run Dam in the flood of 1977. 34, there were 88 people killed in the 77 flood in Johnstown. 34 of them were killed in Tanneryville. The loss of life was probably made, well, not probably, it was absolutely made, it was higher because it was inaccessible. I don't know how well you can see this, but roads just wash out. Whole chunks of highways are just lifted with the power of Mother Nature. I've given presentations, so this is probably somewhere between my 15th, somewhere in the high teens presentation. The first one I gave was at the Blair County Historical Society in Hollidaysburg, and there was a gentleman and his father in the audience, and his father, he was a camp counselor at, there's a Waxahachie Mountain in Blair County. He was a camp counselor at Camp Wapsie on the evening of July 19th. He had children from Tanneryville at his camp, and he said that he remembered having to wake those kids up, let them know we don't know the status of your community, we don't know the status of your family. So it really hit home when that gentleman shared that story. Tanneryville was hit especially hard, and again, a dam that, just like the Southport Fishing and Hunting Club, had been deemed questionable in terms of its stability. The Laurel Run Dam was never rebuilt. It's now part of the Laurel Run State Park. This is a quote from a geotechnical engineer, Elio Di Apollonia, after the 77 flood. speaking of the Laurel Run Dam, its deficiencies were recognized and reports prepared for modification, but for various reasons, over a period of 1.5 decades, remedial steps or new construction was not taken. If the dam had been upgraded in accordance with today's prudent engineering practice, the dam would have been able to store and or pass the 1977 storm. And just to make matters worse, just shortly, actually earlier in 1977, the supervisors in the township where Tanneryville is located voted against participation in the flood insurance program. It would have saved the residents a lot of money, and the surviving residents a lot of money in rebuilding after the 77 flood. Like I said, 86 people were killed. Governor Schwab, he estimated the damages of around $200 million by 77 dollars. 7,000, roughly 7,000 Johnstowners were displaced. The other thing, and again, I don't want to make this uncomfortable, but when you die in a flood, you don't die by drowning in many instances. Debris impales you. And so there was a lot of suffering, I guess, in these events. It's important to be mindful that there was a doctor who I spoke with, and he was the victims that he saw at the hospital. It was a lot of debris had hit people that took their lives. You can see the damage to bridges, to roadways, the power of Mother Nature. There's some images from the 77 flood, again, courtesy of the Johnstown Area Heritage Association. These ones. Debris, you just didn't know what you'd see. Cars stacked like blocks, trees that almost seem like they've wrapped around those stacks of vehicles. It was, people talk about just looking like it was a different world than what they went to bed the night before when they went out. And it got blazing hot. It was July. It got hot, and that ground dried. It was like cement, just dried up hard as cement. And people talk about the stinging scent, the burning scent in their nose after the 77 flood. Again, most of the people I talked to, survivors, were from the 77 flood. Although I did get one in the community I live in Indiana, Pennsylvania, at the Indiana County Historical Society, and there were 2 women there who had survived the 1936 flood from Johnstown. And it was incredible how detailed their stories were. And I guess a traumatic event like that, it's going to stay with you in your memory. Just like FDR freed up some money for Johnstown after the 36 flood, Jimmy Carter did the same thing. They brought federal dollars to help clean up. Pennsylvania state government kicked in money as well. And again, Johnstowners lamented that we had been promised in 36 this wasn't going to happen again, and yet it did. I do want to talk about, I don't want it all to be, the gloom and doom. The people stepped up yet again. People in Pennsylvania, people in Ohio, people in the region. At one point, John Comey, who was coordinating the relief supplies that were coming in, he said people were bringing so much stuff that they didn't know where to put it because it was coming in at such a brisk pace. That's actually water. And ironically, in a flood, one of the things you need the most is potable water. And so those cans, those are National Guard members, that's not soda, that's water that they can, and that they're unloading off of the National Guard truck there. Herb Fuel was the mayor at the time in Johnstown, and he gained the nickname Two Gun Herb. He declared shoot to kill orders to curb looting, to try to curb looting, and there were some editorials that took exception to that. There was an excerpt on the Philadelphia Daily News that talked about, no one was gunned down by Herb Fuel's edict. And at one of my presentations. Again, I've got so many interesting people that have shared so many stories that I really wish I would have had when I wrote the book, right, given these presentations. But I had a guy who attended a presentation I gave in a little town of Hooversville, and he said he was working down at the plant in Sparrows Point at the time, and they were seeing a television news story of the flood in Johnstown, and the reporter said that Herb Fuel, the mayor of Johnstown, had issued a shoot to kill order, and one of his coworkers saw the story, and he said, "You can't do that," and the guy said, "You can do that in my hometown." So anyway, I've learned a lot from people presenting on this. So what happened with Bethlehem Steel? Well, here's some numbers. Middle of the last century, U.S. plants produced roughly half the world's steel. Right, 7 years before the '77 flood, 2 decades later, it was down to 20%. Bethlehem had invested in a basic oxygen furnace, and they were working on that in Johnstown when the '77 flood hit. But again, I argue Bethlehem was asleep at the wheel. The basic oxygen furnace process was invented in 1952. And again, what they were working on, the furnace they were working on in Johnstown was only half completed in 1977. And so they were not being proactive. And I argue that was a big part of Bethlehem's demise. The CEOs of Bethlehem Steel, Eugene Grace, Art Homer, the successors to Charles Schwab, just were not they weren't the risk takers that Charles Schwab was. Bethlehem, after the '77 flood, we're going to have to reassess. 77 is really a day that lives, or a year that lives in infamy for Johnstown. They had a fire at a mine in Pittsburgh that they owned that burned for a while, that they couldn't get coal out of. They had a severe blizzard at the Lackawanna plant in Buffalo in January. They shut down operations there. And then they had major damage that they sustained at their operations in Johnstown as a result of the '77 flood. Louis Foy, he was actually from, for those of you who aren't from the area, the plane, the Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville, close to Johnstown, very close to Johnstown. Louis Foy, who was the CEO at the time of the '77 flood, the CEO of Bethlehem Steel, he was born and raised on a farm in Shanksville, and he really wanted to be the guy that saved jobs for people in the region. And he really got creative to try to keep Bethlehem operating in the city. But again, the writing was on the wall for a number of reasons. Tighter regulation standards with regards to the environment. It was pretty much is the flood of '77 the reason that Bethlehem pulled out of Johnstown? No, but it expedited Bethlehem's departure from the region. And I've been talking for a while. I'm going to wrap up here really quickly. This is just some of the pinballing. Before the '77 flood, they cut some jobs. Then Louis Foy said, "Hey, if we can get some support from business leaders in the area, we'll keep our footprint here." But like I said, that '77 sort of confluence of factors at the Lackawanna plant, the fire in Pittsburgh, the flood in Johnstown, that was the amount of money Bethlehem lost in '77 alone. And it started to cut back both nationally out in the Lehigh Valley as well as in the valley in Johnstown. Operations were consolidated into a division called the Bar, Rod, and Wire Division. And in order to keep jobs, labor gave back a lot to management. But again, it was the end of the line for Bethlehem Steel. In '93, Bethlehem sold its remaining holdings in Johnstown to the Moultrie Steel Products, filed for bankruptcy in '01, and in '03, Bethlehem Steel no longer existed. Now, I was talking to Tom, there is still a little steel. Gautier Steel produces some specialty steel products in the city, but by and large, any steel of any significance is no longer produced in Johnstown. And the one thing that I talk about Johnstown is it's a city that has been really, really hammered in a lot of different ways. The opioid epidemic has hit the county I live in and the Johnstown area specifically very, very hard. Obviously, the floods. It hasn't figured out what its next act is going to be. There was a powerful member of the House of Representatives, Jack Murtha, who was from the Johnstown region, and he had brought some federal contracts to the city. And he died 11 or 12 years ago. When Murtha died, a lot of that money dried up. A lot of those jobs went away. It's still trying to figure out what its next act is going to be. But the one thing that I shared with you tonight, and David McCullough was interviewed after the 77 flood, the author of the Great Flood, the book that I mentioned to you at the start. He was also impressed with the resiliency of the people of Johnstown. One of the challenges we have is our highway infrastructure. We probably, for a city our size, in Pennsylvania, we have the worst highway infrastructure. I interviewed a labor historian that teaches at Lehigh Valley or Lehigh University, because Lehigh bounced back, and he said it was community coming together, but they also, they are also close proximity to major population bases, and they also have, in comparison to what we have in Johnstown, if you're not familiar, we just have we don't have any good highway systems to get in and out of our city. So there's a lot of challenges, and in the conclusion section of my book, I talk about, I make some suggestions on what Johnstown's next act is going to be. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience. I know it's tough for a while. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you all have. If people want to share with me a little bit about the steel industry in this region, or Marcel, if you have any direction you want me to take it at this stage.
The only question I have is, here in Youngstown, we had a really devastating flood in 1913. And it was around Easter time, and it affected a lot of states in the Midwest. I was just wondering, we didn't mention that. That didn't affect you, that?
It did not. It did not hit. I knew about the 13th flood here. We did not get the heavy, in fact, I don't think that was even a minor flooding event in Johnstown in that year. Yeah.
Here we have at least like 4 or 5 large reservoirs and dams that the Army Corps of Engineers built that hold back waters going to Mahoney. And you said that they proposed building reservoirs, but they never did. And I'm surprised. I assume it's the same U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We're part of the Pittsburgh district here. I assume that would be part of the Pittsburgh district there too.
And it was suggested by state officials that be pursued. They strengthened the river walls. They put up, cement river walls. They widened them, but no reservoirs. Still, to this day, there have been no reservoirs that have been put in.
Those lakes were built by the steel companies in here in this valley.
Here.
Yes. In fact, there's a problem now with Colberg Lake. They're concerned about the dam.
Really?
That Youngstown Sheet and Tube built. Because I remember as a kid, when Youngstown Sheet and Tube built that lake, and my father would go take me there to go fishing. And that goes back on. But they're having trouble right now. I don't know what they're going to do. They're probably going to have to breach it, because it's not safe enough. It would go into the Hubbard area and probably flood a lot of people in Hubbard. But those lakes were all built by the steel companies because they use water like crazy to cool their hot steel. And 2 of the big ones were breached, Upper and Lower Liberty Lakes, which were beautiful lakes, and nobody came up with the money to rebuild the dam, so now they're just laying there flat with nothing. And we have McKelvey Lake that's still around. It's beautiful. Although every year they pull out a few cars.
This is a copy of the Johnstown, or the daily newspaper in Johnstown is the Tribune Democrat, and this is from September when I believe it was Hurricane Ida. We came close in terms of not having a reservoir. This is the front page, September 2nd of last year. Parts of the area were evacuated. I'll just read the summary lead to this story. More than 2,000 people were evacuated for up to 6 hours across parts of Wilmore, Southport Borough, which is this is in the vicinity where the Southport Dam has been located. In Summerhill Borough on Wednesday, as a powerful storm lifted Wilmore Dam levels and sent a continuous flow of water into the Little Conemaugh River. Cambria County emergency management officials coordinated efforts with at least a half dozen fire departments and partner agencies moving families to shovel shelters. Thankfully, the rain slowed down, but people ask me, is Johnstown at risk of more flooding? And yes, without question. And another factor in all this, I mentioned the mining. You strip the mines of the coal and the topsoil that used to be able to be absorbed. Right now, it's more of a runway, taking that water down into the valley.
Strip mining.
Yeah, we lost strip mining in our region here.
Real problem.
It was.
Oh, big time. There's a lot of lakes left over that I used to swim in. They were beautiful, clear as a bell. But finally, the government came in and said, hey, you have to, so they reclaimed the land and made it, cleared it up. Right, well, the government came in and made those coal mine companies come in and redo the land.
Yeah, over the last couple of decades.
It was terrible.
Over the last couple of decades in the part of Pennsylvania that I'm from, we call it boning, the large piles of the byproduct of the coal that was extracted that they couldn't burn. And we now have cogeneration plants, their fires can get hot enough to burn that boning. And and again, I mentioned I have two brothers who work for the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection of Pennsylvania. And our area has undergone a facelift. These bony piles, these eyesores have been burned in these cogen plants. Streams are getting cleaned up as a result because you don't have the runoff into the bodies of water. And, it's been a transformation for our area in terms of cleaning up that stuff.
There was an article a number of years ago where there was a certain area of the Allegheny River above Pittsburgh. It was below Erie, Pennsylvania, and Buffalo, in that area there. And for whatever reason, a certain area of that river was so clean, they couldn't believe it. It had absolutely no impurities in it. And it was funny, I followed this story as far as I could, and then all of a sudden, it just dropped out of the sky. And what they were doing is just trying to figure out what the plants were in that section of the river that obviously were filtering, because the water was so pure. And I don't know, I'd probably Google it and find out whatever happened.
Interesting.
But that's amazing that the biologist went in, but they didn't hear anything after the biologist went in to find out what plants were in that part of the river. The water was absolutely perfect. It was almost like it went through 100 filters.
Yeah, I'm an outdoors person, and I've seen our water. I mean, just by being out and seeing our waters get cleaned up, it's been good to see.
Is there fracking in the region though?
There's a little fracking east of us, not anything specifically Cambria County where Johnstown is located. But you get a little bit more toward Blair County, Center County, where State College is. There is some fracking activity that's taking place out there. How about in this area? Is fracking taking place?
We've had several earthquakes as a result of it.
And
I was going to say there's a recent report that in Newcastle, just downriver from us, a radioactive, the frac fluid, the processing plant that's supposed to process and cleaned up, it actually is more radioactive released back into the Mahoning River than when it comes in.
wow.
They just did an article on that.
There's a lot of, again, personal thought. There's a lot of similarities to the full steam ahead with the coal industry. that we had in the region I lived in, and some of the areas where we see the thinking about maybe the environmental consequences after the fact with hydrofracturing.
Now, the most brilliant thing that happened in this valley that was just fantastic is the Youngstown area, their water supply is from the Meander Lake, okay? Now, what they did after they built that dam and everything is they planted pine trees on the periphery of that whole lake. And those little needles act as filters. Very unique, so that water is probably as pure as it's gonna get because of those pine needles that drop off every year. And they match and form a filtering system. So any water coming in from any side of that lake is gonna get filtered.
Mother Nature has it a lot better than we have it. Our strategies.
And it doesn't cost them anything for the filtration.
Affordable filtration system.
Right.
Well, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I have books. I have copies. If anybody wants to buy a copy, I'm happy to, like I said, I have flyers as well. If you know somebody that might be able to grab one of those, share it with somebody else.
So Pat, this seems like a natural for the Weather Channel. Get some computer graphics to explain the weather system, maybe a voiceover from Jim Cantor.